Shalom, my dear friends. Shalom. Today, the 29th day of Tishrei, corresponding to the 31st day of October. And once again today, like yesterday, Baruch Hashem, technical problems, and I'm not quite sure how to overcome this today without taking an inordinate amount of time. As I have indicated in the Zamra online chat room, my difficulty today is not being able to get you Hebrew text on your screen, and this is very vexing, as I had hoped to be able to continue with our study of the Mishnah, and I would like to do so in any event. The reason being that we have this week to complete the tractate of Horayot before my departure for London, England, and therefore I'm anxious to proceed with this. I know this has been a challenging tractate for some people here, and it's going to continue to be somewhat challenging today. May I ask those of you who are in the chat room if you do have access to some Mishnah text, so you will be able to follow along as I study today. And I'd like to hear from you if I shall indeed, as we said, proceed today, even in the absence of the ability to put text on your screen for reasons that I cannot at the moment ascertain. Okay, well, in that case, let me, having positive messages from Jake and Adonit here, then, Catherine, could you kindly indicate, and Robbie, if you can indeed see and hear the live video at the moment, and if so, then let me now, God willing, begin with our Mishnah. Shalom. Today, the 29th day of the month of Tishrei of the year 5777, corresponding to the 30th of October of the year 2016. And we continue now with our study of the tractate of Horayot, beginning at the 5th Mishnah of the 2nd chapter. I would like to, before we enter into the text of this Mishnah, just give a very quick resume of the somewhat bewildering array of sin offerings that the Torah teaches us, the different sin offerings that will come to atone for different sins. One general division that we must face up to today is the division between the Chatat offering and the Asham offering. Both of those words could be translated as a sin offering, or in the case of the Asham offering, a guilt offering. There are two different categories of offerings, and each one of them also divides into a number of subcategories, and that is what is somewhat bewildering. For most of this tractate, we've been dealing with decisions by the Sanhedrin in an area relating to a Torah prohibition that not only carries with it the penalty of lashes, but also the much more severe penalty of karet. Not all of the prohibitions of the Torah are liable to the penalty of karet, but those transgressions for which we have to bring a chatat offering are those transgressions which carry with them the penalty of karet if the person violated them intentionally. And those sin offerings are offered respectively by a high priest or by a Sanhedrin, or by a prince of the people, the king, or by a regular Israelite in different circumstances. And these are the sin offerings that are enumerated in Leviticus chapter 4, successively the high priest, the Sanhedrin, the king or prince of the people, and the regular Israelite. And those four categories have different offerings to bring. In the case of the high priest or the Sanhedrin, it would not be that they did the action, but that they made a ruling to permit the forbidden action or part of it. And for the prince, the king, and a regular Israelite, it will be if they actually violated the prohibition. They were not involved in making rulings on these subjects. That is what is called a regular chatat offering. Now, there is another subdivision of chatat sin offerings, which are enumerated in Leviticus chapter 5. And these sin offerings are brought if a person committed a number of specified sins that are enumerated there in Leviticus chapter 5. And among the what is special about this category of sin offerings for specific sins that are enumerated in Leviticus chapter 5 is that the sacrifice that the individual brings will vary according to his means. If he's wealthy enough, he will have to bring an animal sacrifice. If he's less wealthy, he'll have to bring a pair of birds. And if he's a poor, he'll bring a meal offering. And the passage in Leviticus chapter 5 enumerates 3 areas in which if a person sinned, they would bring these ole v'yored, going up, going down offerings on the mean scale. And they're number 1, if a person was a witness to something and he was called to the bet din, to the court to testify, but he says to the person in whose favor he was asked to testify, he never saw anything, he didn't know, then he has to bring this up and down sacrifice. Second category would be if a person were ritually impure and either they entered into the temple or they ate sacrificial foods in a state of impurity and they didn't know about it until later. A third transgression which would carry this up and down offering is the offering if somebody swore an oath and broke his oath. In those cases, those 3 cases, the person would bring the up and down offering, the means-tested offering enumerated in Leviticus 5. Now, we mentioned yesterday in Numbers 15, the Torah also speaks about a sin offering, a chatat, and that is the specific offering that is brought if the sin in question involved idolatry. So all those are examples of chatat offerings. The regular chatat offering for a sin carrying the penalty of karet. The up and down sin offering, means tested for those specific 3 transgressions, entering the temple instead of impurity, or eating sacrifice instead of impurity, swearing falsely, or refusing to testify when one does no testimony. Those 3 have the specific up and down sacrifice. Now, the second main division is of the asham, and the asham offering also falls into 2 divisions. There is what is called the asham talui, the suspended asham. This is where a person carried out one of the sins in the Torah, carrying with it where they're not sure if they did the sin or not. One of the sins carrying the penalty of karet. They're not sure, did they eat the forbidden fat or was the fat that they eat permitted? The person, another classic example given of this would be if a person was in a dark house at night and his wife was there and his own sister was there, and he bumped into somebody at night and had intimate relations. He's not sure who it was, his wife or his sister, where in the case of his wife, there's no transgression, of course. If it was his sister, he's liable to a sin carrying the penalty of karet, excision. And if the two of them were asleep and he didn't know, that is the extreme case given, then he'd have to bring the asham talui, the dependent asham. He has to bring it to stave off punishment in case he did sin. So the asham talui is a kind of sin offering, but brought where a person is not sure if they committed the sin and they do want to placate and conciliate the Almighty. The second division of the asham offering is specific guilt offerings specified by the Torah for in 5 separate instances. A Nazirite may have to bring an asham offering. The leper, when he brings his sacrifices of conciliation, will bring the asham offering. There's a particular case of a Canaanite slave woman who was half free and engaged to be married, who had relations with somebody else, where the asham offering has to be brought by the person that had relations with her. There's also the asham offering brought specifically in a case where a person had private benefit of temple property. And finally, there is the asham offering specified if a person held onto somebody else's money illegally and would have to bring this offering. So with that introduction, let us now go into Mishnah 5, which is going to start to distinguish between the various liabilities for these different kind of sin offerings, depending on whether it is the high priest, the Sanhedrin making a ruling, or the Nasi, the king or leader, or an individual Israelite. So Mishnah 5 of Horayot chapter 2. Ein chayovin al shmias hakol. A person is not liable for the for having heard a voice, literally. That means shmias kol is the phrase that the Torah uses in the case of a witness who knew testimony, and the Mishnah is just elusively referring to this. If the Sanhedrin or the high priest made a ruling in a wrongful ruling in the case of one of these 3 sins that involves not the regular sin offering, but the up and down or v'yored offering. The first of these is shmiat kol, hearing a report if the person was a witness. Number 2, v'al bitui sefosayim, over the expression of the lips. That is an allusion to the sacrifice brought if a person made a false oath, if they took an oath and later broke it. And thirdly, v'al tumas mikdosh ukadoshov, over the impurity of the temple and its holy dedicated sacrificial portions. For those 3 transgressions where the penalty is not the regular sin offering for unwitting transgression, but the up and down offering, if the Bet Din or the high priest were to rule in these cases, they would not be liable to the sacrifice of the ox, as specified in Leviticus chapter 4. The Mishnah continues, Anosi kayotze vohem. Likewise, the Nasi, the king, where we see in Leviticus 4 that the king has his own special sacrifice if he were to transgress one of the sins carrying the karet penalty. But if the king transgressed one of those 3 sins involving the up and down offering, he would not be liable to the special sin offering of the king enumerated in Leviticus chapter 4. Rabbi Akiva oimer, anosi chayov bechulon chutz mishmias hakol. Rabbi Akiva I missed out a section. The first, what we've heard in our Mishnah until now are the words of Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, the first opinion. The second opinion is that of Rabbi Akiva, who dissents in the case of the king. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Anosi chayuv b'chulon chutz mishmias hakol. He says the prince will be liable, the king will be liable to the specified sin offering over any of these three transgressions involving the up and down sacrifice, chutz mishmias hakol, except if the king knew testimony and did not want to go to the Bet Din to testify. He refused to go. He would not be liable to the sacrifice for refusing to go to the court. And the reason is, Shahamelech loydon v'loydon in oisoi. The king cannot either rule nor cannot judge in a legal case, and nor can they judge him. The king is exempt from a regular legal procedure. Lo me'id v'lo me'id in oisoi. He does not testify in the court, and they can't testify against him in the court. In other words, the king is exempt from the normal involvement in the legal system. In the case of testimony, it would be beneath the dignity of the king to be expected to show up in a court to give testimony. And for that reason, Rabbi Akiva holds that he would be exempt from bringing testimony, and therefore, if he was asked to bring testimony and refused, he would not be liable to the sacrifice. Well, now in Mishnah 6, we go on to and we're going to be involved for the rest of this chapter in issues relating to the different categories of sin and guilt offerings. So Mishnah 6, Mishnah Vov, Kol ha-mitzvos shebaTorah shechayoven al zedonon kores v'al shigagoson chatos. All of the commandments of the Torah where a person is liable to a sin, is liable to the penalty of excision if they willfully violated the prohibition, or if it was an unwitting violation, they would be liable to the sin offering. This is a point that I've repeated several times. I repeated it today in the introduction to the previous Mishnah. Our present Mishnah, Mishnah 6, is summing up all of those sins that willful violation involve the penalty of karet, excision, and unwitting violation would require the individual, when he found out about it, to bring a sin offering. Hayochid mevi kispa useiro. If it was an individual Israelite that transgressed this Torah prohibition, he would bring as his regular hatat offering, his regular sin offering, kispa, either a female lamb, or useiro, a female goat. For a private individual, the sacrifice is a female animal for reasons bound up with the mystical meanings of the Torah. An individual who sins in this category will bring a female animal. This is all stated explicitly in the verses in Leviticus chapter 4. V'hanosi so'ir. If it was the nasi, the king, he would have to bring a goat offering as specified there in Leviticus chapter 4. Umoshiach uveis din mavin por. The Moshiach, this is the high priest that has been anointed with the temple anointing oil, which was only available in the time of the first temple. If it was the anointed high priest or the Sanhedrin, the Bet Din, if they transgress one of these sins carrying the penalty of karet for willful transgression, or of the sin offering for unwitting transgression, in each case they would bring the sacrifices specified there in Leviticus chapter 4, the ox. And the Mishnah continues the conclusion of Mishnah 6. If the transgression involved avodah zarah, idolatry. So here we move over to Book of Numbers, chapter 15, the special sacrifice applying in the case of idolatry. Hayochid, v'hanosi, v'hamoshiach, mevin se'iro. If it was a private Israelite individual, male or female, or if it were the king, or if it was the high priest, they would bring the female goat offering as specified in Numbers chapter 15. Uvezdin par v'so'ir. If it was the Sanhedrin that erred in a ruling regarding idolatry, they would have to bring an ox and a male goat, par la'olah, the ox, the bull, as an olah offering, a fully burned offering. All of the portions are burned on the altar. V'so'ir lechatos, it will be a goat for a sin offering in the case of idolatry. So now in Mishnah 7, we continue to look at how the various categories of these offerings apply to the different categories of individual, the high priest, the Sanhedrin, the king, or a private individual. And as I said, there's the two broad categories. There's the chatat, sin offering, having two subdivisions. One, if it's for a transgression involving the prohibition of karet. The second division of the chatat offering is the up and down sin offering for those three specific transgressions we mentioned earlier. Then on the other side of the division is the asham offering, translated as the guilt offering, which has two kinds: the asham talui, the dependent or conditional offering. Did the person sin or not? They don't know. They want to bring a sacrifice. And then the other form of asham offering for one of those five particular transgressions that I mentioned earlier, for stealing, for benefiting from temple goods, for the Canaanite half-free slave woman that had relations with somebody other than her engaged husband-to-be, the Nazarite, and the leper. So these are the categories we need to have in mind as we go into Mishnah 7, Zayin. Asham talui, the conditional guilt offering, where the person is in doubt, did they or did they not sin? Who brings such an offering? Hayochid v'hanosi chayovin. If it is a private individual, or if it is the king, then they would be liable. If they were in doubt whether they committed this sin or not, did they eat the forbidden fat, did they or did they not have relations with a forbidden incest individual? Umoshiach uveistin pturin. However, the high priest, if he got himself into a doubt about such a thing, or if it was the Sanhedrin who ruled in such a case, they will be exempt. In other words, the Asham Talui, the conditional guilt offering, does not apply to the high priest or to the Sanhedrin. Asham Vadai, when it comes to the definite Asham, one of those guilt offerings brought for the 5 cases of stealing money, of embezzling temple property, of the Canaanite maidservant who had illicit relations with somebody other than her engaged husband-to-be, the Nazarite, and the leper. So to whom does this Asham sacrifice apply? Asham Vadai, the definite Asham offering. Hayochid v'anosi v'amoshiach chayovin. An individual Israelite, male or female, or the king, or the anointed high priest, they would all be liable to the Asham offerings brought were they to transgress one of those 5 categories, involved in one of those 5 categories. Uveistin peturin, the Sanhedrin would be exempt. If the Sanhedrin ruled in a case involving one of these 5 areas, they ruled wrongly, nevertheless they'll be exempt from the punishment. The concept of the Asham offering does not apply to the Sanhedrin. Next, the Mishnah continues with those three specific transgressions for which the sin offering is the oile v'yored, the up and down, means-tested offering. Al shmias hakol, over the hearing of a report, a voice, namely over a person's knowing testimony but refusing to go to the court to testify. V'al bitui sfosayim, over the expression of the lips, namely an oath which a person falsely later took the oath and then broke it or swore falsely. V'al tumas mikdosh v'kodoshov, over defilement in the case of the temple and its holy dedicated sacrificial portions. That is to say, if a person entered the temple in a state of ritual impurity, if he ate sacrificial meat in a state of ritual impurity, Bezdin Pturin, the Sanhedrin ruling in those cases would be exempt from the sin offerings specified in Leviticus chapter 5. They do not apply to the Sanhedrin. V'ya yochid, v'ya nosi, v'ya moshiach chayovin, a private individual or the king or the anointed high priest would be liable to these sacrifices. Elo she'en kohen godel chayov al tumas mikdosh v'kodoshov divrei Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon has a dissenting opinion with respect to the high priest. If the high priest were to enter the temple in a state of impurity or to eat sacrifices in a state of impurity, according to Rabbi Shimon, he would be exempt from the specified sacrifice. Umahein meviin, in the case of these three sins enumerated in chapter 5 of Leviticus, what would be the sacrifice brought for those who have to bring it? The Mishnah concludes the end of chapter 2 of Horayot, Kurban oile v'yored. This is the sacrifice that goes up and down, up to animal sin offering if the person is wealthy enough. In the middle is a pair of birds, one a sin offering, one a whole burnt offering. And if the person doesn't have the means to bring either of those two, they bring a meal offering as specified in Leviticus chapter 5 for these three transgressions. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer dissents from the previous opinion. He says, Anosi mevi so'ir. If the king were to violate one of these three prohibitions in the Torah, the king would have to bring the sin offering stated for the Nasi, the king in Leviticus chapter 4, namely an ox. According to Rabbi Eliezer, the aspect of means testing for the king would not apply, and he would always bring, I think I said an ox. The sa'ir is not an ox, the sa'ir is a goat. It will be a goat offering according to Rabbi Eliezer. However, the actual halacha is that if the king were to sin, he would bring the regular oile v'yored offering, and he would bring the top category, namely the animal offering. Well, my dear friends, I'm very, very sorry about our difficulties today and not being able to follow the Hebrew text with you on the screen. I'm not sure if I will succeed in getting this up for you for the next part of today's study. I'm going to take a brief interval now, and I'll see if anything can be done. In any event, God willing, I will be back with you in just a few minutes. Shalom again. Shalom for the next section of today's studies. I do apologize for the technical hitch, which I've still not been able to figure out as to why my system is not doing what it's always been doing very well. That is to pick up the camera that we have here, the document camera, to show you text on screen, but apparently I'm not going to be able to do that. I would appreciate now some response from those of you who are signed into the online Azamra Bet Midrash. If you would kindly let me know if you can see and hear me at the moment, and just as soon as I do hear from you, then I would like to continue with today's studies. So please do let me know if you're able to see and hear me now. And I'd like to go on talking about our chapters of Isaiah, chapters 52 and 53, the subject of the suffering servant. So please do speak up if you are able to. Oh, good. Well, thank you, Jake, and thank you, Adonit, and now thank you, Robbie. Well, that's great. Thank you very much for letting me know. So we've been talking about the whole subject of the suffering servant, and I'd like, before in the next session, this coming Wednesday, God willing, in 2 days' time, when I will be looking at what the Holy Zohar has to say about these chapters. But before we come to that, let's go back now over the text and look at the text in the light of what we have heard from Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto in the Derech Hashem, the way of God, where we looked last week at his teachings about how suffering may be imposed on the tzaddik in order to satisfy the attribute of justice. And then yesterday we took a look at the liturgical poem in the Yom Kippur prayers at the very height of the Musaf service, the poem of Eile Ezkara, these things shall I remember, about the 10 Harugei Malchut, the 10 martyrs of the Roman government during the occupation of the Holy Land during and after the destruction of the Second Temple. And my purpose in looking at that section was because I think it throws light on what Ramchal is saying in the Derech Hashem. Clearly, Ramchal, speaking about the price exacted from tzaddikim in terms of suffering in order to atone for the people as a whole, Ramchal was not talking about suffering suffered by just anybody. Clearly, the whole tenor of the book of Job's question is not, why is there suffering? It's very obvious to Job and to the three first people that debate with him up until the early chapter 30s of Job. It's quite clear to them that suffering is the wages of sin, whether it is sent immediately or at a later stage. There's no question in the mind of either Job or his interlocutors that this is the case. What is Job's question is, well, why do the righteous suffer? And as I mentioned yesterday, that is not answered directly in the book of Job. In the final discourses of Elihu Barachel, the fourth interlocutor who comes into Job after the first three have been silenced, it's Elihu that seeks to address the question, why do the tzaddikim suffer, and does allude to the case where the tzaddik suffers to atone for the community. But it's only in our section of Isaiah that this is really addressed in this prophetic manner. And my purpose of reading about the 10 sages that were martyred, that obviously they were all on the most outstanding levels. That is why they were the high priest, Rabbi Yishmael, the high priest, and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, the head of the Sanhedrin, and Rabbi Akiva, like whom there was no other sage in the subtlety with which he explained the texts of the Torah, and so on. All of these people were obviously righteous tzaddikim. And what our liturgical poem, Ela Eskara, is teaching us is that these 10 tzaddikim were suffering not because of any sin they themselves sinned, but they were suffering in order to expiate some very ancient mark that stood over the people of Israel on account of the behavior of the 10 brothers that sold Joseph into slavery. There was a very profound process working itself out, and there was a reason why, in order to save the Jewish people after the destruction of the temple from even worse suffering and, God forbid, even extinction, it was necessary for these 10 to give up their lives. And so when we now come back to look at Isaiah 52 and 53 with that perspective, I think that we should be looking to draw out 2 points at this moment. The first is that the righteous tzaddik may come to atone for the people of Israel. And the second is that the people of Israel, that is to say the righteous of the people of Israel, who have been subjected to so much oppression and persecution during the thousands of years of exile, their suffering also atones for the nations of the world. In other words, as opposed to the Christian theological approach to these chapters, that there is only one, can he be called a person being spoken about here, and that is the founder of the Christian tradition, we are saying, and this I think we shall see from our Meforshim, our commentators on these passages, that it is the righteous in Israel that are atoning for the people as a whole, and that the righteous of Israel are also atoning for the nations as a whole. And the first point to be made in pursuing this interpretation of these chapters, if you look at the section about the suffering servant in itself, it only really starts at the end of chapter 52, verse 13. That is when the concept of the servant first is introduced. Chapter 52, verse 13, behold, my servant shall be wise, he shall be exalted, he shall be raised up, he shall be elevated very much. Well, now, if we go back and look at the previous passages, the previous portions in chapter 52, they're all about the people of Israel as a whole. If you start off at the beginning, if you go further back in the previous chapters, all of the chapters from 40 onwards in Isaiah, all talking about the coming redemption and the glorious future that will be coming to Zion, to Zion. And Zion is represented in different ways in the imagery of those chapters. And when we get so already, sometimes the prophet addresses Yerushalayim, sometimes he addresses Zion, and he's evoking the community of Israel in these different ways, as you can see just by glancing at the chapters previous to chapter 52. 52 itself begins, stir yourself, gird yourself with your might, O Zion, garb yourself in your garments of glory. Jerusalem, again speaking to Jerusalem as the national focus of the whole people of Israel. Then in verse 3 of chapter 52, he's obviously speaking to the whole people. You were sold for nothing. You went to Egypt. You went to Assyria. So this addressing the whole people. Then verse 7 in chapter 52 speaks about the those who are coming to announce the coming redemption, the voice of the prophets, all prophesying the return of God to Zion and the wonderful joy that will burst forth. Then in verse 11 of chapter 52, we're talking about how the land of Israel and Jerusalem were purified of all the impure people who have been defiling the sanctity of Jerusalem and of Israel. And obviously, all the way up till the end of verse 12, the prophet is addressing Israel. So when he comes in verse 13 to say, Hine yaskil avdi, behold, my servant shall be wise, it's pretty obvious from the context that the servant in question is either Israel as a whole, or particularly the messianic king of Israel and the righteous of Israel, who have held the people for all of the years of the exile, and who will be revealed in his glory, the true tzaddik, with the redemption. And so when the whole section about the suffering servant really begins, as I say, in chapter 52 of Isaiah, verse 13, and there is a small break at the end of our English chapter 52 going into 53. The Hebrew text is separated by a letter samach in the printed Tanakh, indicating what is called a parasha stuma, that the portion beginning in 53 is not entirely separate from what went before. It's a slight shift and an elaboration of what went before. But all the prophecies from chapter 52, verse 13 onwards are all part of the same cycle. And as I say, looking at this section in the wider context of what came before and afterwards, if you look what comes at the end of chapter 53, you go right into chapter 54. Obviously there it's talking again about the restored Zion and Yerushalayim, the wonderful fruitfulness that will be revealed in the people of Israel after the redemption. So it's all part of one cycle. So the key to the whole section is chapter 52, verse 14. Just as the many were amazed over you, because the appearance of the suffering servant was so diminished from that of a person who was so deformed and disfigured. Well, now here our commentator Rashi on verse 14 states explicitly that these multitudes that were so amazed over this disfigured individual, the suffering servant, these are the nations of the world. This is Rashi going in one direction. And the nations of the world are amazed at Israel, the great shift. Rashi says, just as the many nations were stunned and astounded when they saw Israel in their degradation, and they said to one another, how disfigured from the appearance of a person is Israel in this degraded state. And see how their appearance has descended from that of all of the rest of the nations. So they will be astounded when they see the Israel in the state of the future redemption. So Rashi's main direction in explaining this whole section about the suffering servant is clearly to look at it as the nations being astounded over Israel in their degradation and coming out of it. We have the same in verse 1 of chapter 53. Who believed what our ears are hearing, with the over whom was the mighty arm of Hashem revealed? Again, Rashi states quite clearly, Kein yomiru agoyim ish l're'ehu. So shall the nations say one to the other. If we had heard about this spectacular specter of Israel rising out of this degradation, we would never have believed it. It's only when they will actually hear and see with their own eyes this staggering redemption. So Rashi here is taking this as Israel's coming to atone for the nations, and all of Rashi's explanation of the people that are speaking in the verses of Isaiah 53, where it's not specified always exactly who is speaking. It's clear that Rashi brings this upon the nations of the world. Likewise in verse 6. Verse 6, after we heard in verse 5 how this suffering individual was suffering because of our sins, Rashi is interpreting this once again as being in the mouths of the nations. And in verse 6, Rashi says on the Hebrew words, we have all gone astray like flock. Each person turned to their own way, and God has struck him, has visited the sin of everybody on this suffering servant. Rashi again in verse 6 puts these words into the mouths of the nations. He says, now it is revealed that all of the nations were in error, and God was only willing to conciliate over the king of all of us, says Rashi, paraphrasing the verse, so as not to destroy the world because of the suffering of this suffering servant. So the point that I'm trying to bring out today as an introduction to our going into the Holy Zohar in our next session on Wednesday is that Rashi, who leads the all of our commentators in the interpretation of this verse, Rashi is specifically learning out the whole thing as a parable of Israel suffering to attain for the nations, and of course the simple clear meaning that there is a righteous person that is suffering to atone for others. As we shall see in our next session, in the Holy Zohar, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai takes us in a very different direction, where the way that the Zohar interprets the whole passage is as going on the figure of none other than Moshe Rabbeinu. It's highly ironic that in the replacement therapy, the replacement theology of the church, the very passage that, according to our mystical tradition, is speaking about Moses is, as it were, taken away from Moses and put onto somebody else. So that itself is part of the suffering of Moses, that Moses is being rejected by the wider world, and that is what we shall come to with God's help in our next session. With that, I would like to bid you shalom from Jerusalem for today. I do again regret the technical issues that have been besetting us, and I hope that with God's help they will be solved before next time. And for now, let us bring today's session to a close. I wish you shalom and blessings from Jerusalem.